Hello, good evening, good afternoon, good morning, good tidings, salutations, whatever time and whatever place that we meet you, we are glad to meet you. Welcome to Generational Archives. It's the show where we connect, heal, uncover through intergenerational conversations and archival research. I'm Dr. Raina J. León. I'm your scholar, your creative, your very sick, pregnant person in the attic right now, isolating in my mother's home, taking care of all those around me by staying by myself, only with the plants to look at. And I'm here with my mother, Dr. Norma D. Thomas. Mommy, how are you going to introduce yourself today?
Well, I am your mother, and I guess I'm the caregiver, and I'm the person that climbs in upstairs to the upstairs every now and then and drops off food and takes down trash and dishes. So that is what we are doing today. But I'm also introducing myself as a person who, along this ancestral journey, keeps learning information, and some of it is not happy.
Right. So we're going to go straight into our topic for today rather than doing a check-in question. So you discovered something very fascinating recently. I want to say that I got this random text message from you like, "Oh, did you know about John Logan who was executed and had this cr- um court case that went all the way to the Supreme Court, but it was in the context of like, oh, have you arrived from the airport yet?" Like it was totally embedded in this random stream of text. And I was like, "Wait, what just happened?" Like so, who was John Logan, mommy?
Well, John Logan was my grandmother's brother, and I realized although I had him listed with all of them in the ancestry.com listing, that this is the one person, and I think there was 14 of them altogether, that maybe not so many, but there were so a lot of Nanacera's brothers and one sister that I had heard of all of them. And I realized that this John, that nobody ever mentioned him. I never had met him. And even though I met some of her older siblings along the way, this is one that had never been mentioned. So, one of these random days looking on ancestry.com, all of these articles popped up on this John Logan, who was executed by the electric chair and whose case went all the way to the Supreme Court. So the story that seems to have been pieced together is that during Prohibition, he was in a car that got stopped in an alley, I believe, and there were three other people in the car. And it was stopped by, what do they call them? Dry agents or
Yes.
something, but a federal agent, that stopped them. And it looks like there was a bribe, and he didn't accept it. It was a bigger bribe. He didn't accept it, and he got shot and killed. And they looked for them for a little while, finally found them, and ultimately they were convicted. At least three of the four were convicted, and it was two of them that were executed. But the reason this went to the Supreme Court is none of the three could be identified as the shooter. So, although they were not any of them identified as the person who actually shot this agent, whose last name was York, I believe.
Yeah, this was Prohibition agent Lamar Watson York.
So none of them were convicted of actually shooting him, but individually they weren't convicted. But then the jury convicted them all of shooting him. And so the Supreme Court was asked to decide, can you be group convicted, I guess, of shooting someone if individually you haven't been convicted? Now, I haven't seen the actual writing of the result of the Supreme Court decision, but obviously the answer must have been yes, because at least two of them were executed by electric chair. And it took a couple of years before this actually occurred. I also told Raina that I saw an additional article that said the wife of this agent was given an appointment by J. Edgar Hoover, who was the president at that time, about 5 weeks after her husband was killed, and she was able to get this appointment without going through the whole process. So there are a number of articles about them having to be retried and things being looked at again, and all kinds of implications that would say that they probably did not get a fair trial in the beginning. We have to assume that this agent was white, they're African American. And actually, you brought up another issue that our, what would he be, great
So
grandfather?
great uncle, right?
Well, his uncle, but our
Oh yes.
grandfather
Mm-hmm.
was had a operated an illegal still down in Saluda, South Carolina, because you said, where did they get the liquor from that was in the car?
Right.
And
So
although this was in Washington, D.C., it was like, oh, did they go down to South Carolina and fill up the car with illegal liquor?
well,
But that's
and that's
speculation.
yeah, the reason I thought that was because in part of our trip down to South Carolina a few years back, we had this fascinating conversation with the Mr. Logan, one of our extended relatives, and learned about the location of the still of our great grandfather, my great grandfather, Pinckney Satterwhite. And the story was that he was uh making his distilling at the time liquor, of course, during a time of prohibition. And so he had a relationship with many of the law officers at the time, and they would actually go to his establishment and get plastered. So they just had this relationship um between them of, prohibition. They kind of skirted the laws, not kind of, they did skirt the laws. And we learned more about the influence of that still on alcohol and alcoholism within
Hmm.
our family, um, and uh, the accessibility of really high proof alcohol in these secret stashes within that space. But there's also this tension that you've talked about several times between the Satterwhites and the Logans. The Satterwhites, Walter Satterwhite being Pinckney's son, and our Nana Sarah being the wife of Walter Satterwhite. Her brother, John Logan, is now one of those four people who has this van filled with liquor. As I said, where did he get all the liquor from? Um, did it come up the highway from South Carolina? Who knows? Who knows what the story is? But the other fuller story is that it's interesting that he was even involved, because when you look at the census records in 1930, just before this would have happened with the killing of Agent York, um, he owned a garage. He was a manager. So that's how he's listed in the census. It also notes that he didn't attend school, but he could read and write. This is 1930. So for access um and mobility, social mobility, like, he was doing pretty well. He lived right next door to his wife's parents, where his brother-in-law lived. He had two young children that were maybe like 5 and 2 or something like that when this all happens. He has every reason not to get involved in this. And he has his own business. Like, he doesn't seem to need another illicit pathway to income, especially as someone who has, the ability to employ other people. He's listed in the census as an employer. So he has a lot of power. And then in 1930, this happens. And in the articles, it lists that he identifies the other person that was executed as the shooter. And which is fascinating to me too. In the article that actually notes um, the execution story, it says that that John Logan and John Burham, both colored, were electrocuted for slaying Prohibition agent Lamar W. York when he was attempting to arrest them on a liquor charge in April 1930. Logan died first. He walked the 100 feet more or less from the door to the desk chair hurriedly. He was smiling. Accompanying him was the Reverend James L. Pinn, pastor of the Colored Goodwill Baptist Church. He was placed in the chair at 10 o'clock. At 10:07, he was officially pronounced dead by acting coroner A. Magruder McDonald and Dr. Walter K. Angevina, jail physician. And right after that, Borum enters into the death chamber. He's supported by the guards because he actually has been impacted by a disease of the throat gland that continues. And he dies soon after that, after being electrocuted. But the story of him accusing the other person of shooting the shot, and then the case is such that they don't convict any person but find all culpable to the point of execution, leaving this family without a father, is and then the erasure of this person within our family from any storytelling that you've heard. And mommy, you said, right, you've heard of everybody, you met all these people and never heard his name. We wanted to record this podcast to also speak to the traumas that affect our families that lead to the erasures of family history, and what do we do with that. So
Well, you also found an article on the Sun.
right, yeah, there was their their life definitely was no easy path after that. The son ultimately ends up himself in trouble with the law at 18, is accused of arrested for breaking into a jewelry store and being caught with a number of watches and a number of jewel um, things from the jewelry store, including pens. Like it's fascinating what's noted within the article, like 15 pens. And after that, I don't see any mention of him except for when he dies in the mid 2000s, or around 2012 or so. But and I now know that he himself had a daughter. So what she knows of her grandfather, of my great many times great uncle, and what that did to their lives, who knows? But I think that story is also something that points us into thinking about, like, what are the damages that happen within the lives of those left behind, and how is it that a person is erased from this family storytelling? Is it because they believed in his innocence? Is it is it because they knew he was guilty and felt ashamed? Like, but at the same time, this is a person who lives a full, not a full life. He died at, in his 30s, but lived as a vibrant member of a family and a community, and then was erased from storytelling because of this horrible thing that happened.
And you found that in the census, I guess it would have been the 1940 census, that his wife was now living with her parents.
That's right. In the 1930 census, it lists that John and his wife and 2 children were living right next door to her parents. And so 10 years later in the census, it also indicates that she's now living with her parents. So I didn't look for addresses to see if they were in the same area, but that she had at least the support of her people to help with the raising of her children.
So yes, and looking at the stories at first, it was incredulous actually,
Right.
because you think nothing like this has ever happened to anyone in your family. And then you realize that all of the things that have happened in society could have impacted your family like everyone else's. So this as those stories that I never heard, but they are stories nonetheless.
Yeah, and I think that it's a shame that it took you randomly having these pop-ups on Ancestry to discover something about a member of our family that had this who was executed. Um, and this happened in 1930, almost 100 years now. That
Mm,
doesn't seem like he's been talked about. And I think too that this piece of being open to the ancestors and and responding to their desires for connection continues within this podcast, right? We start to have conversations about prepare to have a conversation about grandmom, Queen Esther, and a tape of her voice appears. We start to have conversations about Aunt Doris, and all these articles appear. We start to have conversations about erasure or remembrance within a museum, for example, and all of a sudden John Logan is like, yo, people aren't remembering me and I want to be remembered too. Um, and these articles appear. So I think it has something, some wisdom to offer others who are listening, that, you know, being open to the ancestors also invites us into being open to their stories that appear and listening.
well, and the African proverb is that as long as you speak someone's name, they are still with us. So I guess John wanted somebody to speak his name
Yeah.
and to
So
make sure that his story is a cautionary tale. We don't have all the details, but again, there's hints of injustice because there were articles about a retrial, and this went all the way to the Supreme Court. And so we need to, it says how we should pay attention to the criminal justice system.
right, right, absolutely. And so if, you know, our ancestor John Logan has asked for us to speak his name, we speak his name,
Mhm.
and also call attention to the erasure of the stories of those who are impacted by the criminal justice system, whether that is through the atrocities of execution, or through being held um, without bail or with bail, but it's so high that you can't have access to your own freedom.
Mhm.
um, you know, being held while accused for such a long time because you're poor and don't have access to your own freedom while pursuing justice. So there's so much to that this story calls us to be attentive to. Um,
And I just wanted to, before we close, update folks on the progress of the museum
yeah.
that, as you've heard in previous podcasts, I did purchase a building. It's an old house, almost 100-year-old house itself. And we are in the process as old people, me and my husband and my brother, renovating this old house, which is slowly coming to fruition. We have a lot of the upstairs done and have taken some items from here to there to begin to display. And so at some point, again, hopefully during February, Black History Month, we'll be able to have an opening for the museum and offer what we have there to the public. So
Okay.
that's the update. We should have kept done pictures of the before and after, so maybe going forward, we'll do some of those before after pictures so you can see our progress and what we are doing. And at some point, we will be looking for your support.
Mm-hmm. And so I'm really looking forward to providing some more updates as you go with the museum. Super exciting. And we thank you all for continuing on the journey with us. I know we're not so regular, but it's, it's my fault. It's my fault. But I hope that you are encouraged wherever you are in your own journey. And when the ancestors call, that you answer by speaking their names, and whatever healing that comes, that it is a healing.
And
And
one of your cousins said to me recently, Raina,
uh
that on your dad's side, that she feels like she knows our whole family by listening to the Generational Archives podcast. So she feels like she knows the whole family.
oh, well, that's great. That's great.
Yeah.
So you who are listening, thank you for listening and getting to know our family. And I hope that
Please
this,
like and subscribe.
like and subscribe. And I hope this brings you into closer relationship with all of your community of care, whether they are blood bonded or through other lineages or family that you have chosen, however you define family and kin. But again, like and subscribe, share the news with others, and we look forward to connecting with you next time.
Bye
Bye-bye.
bye.